Hi, welcome to episode 3 of The Story Behind Christmas. The title for this episode is An Abysmal Failure, ? And that question mark is quite important. You remember last time we saw Matthew's short 3-stage version of the family tree of Jesus. Let's just remind ourselves of that family tree. From Abraham to David were 14 generations, stage 1. From David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, that's stage 2. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations, that's stage 3. We looked at stage 1 and we saw some of the promises made to Abraham being fulfilled. It took 1,000 years, but Abraham's descendants became a great nation, Israel, and David was king of that nation. We also saw some of the promises to King David being fulfilled. David's son Solomon became king, and Solomon built a temple to God's name in Jerusalem. But there are other parts of the promises which we haven't yet seen being fulfilled in the story. God promised Abraham that his descendants would be a blessing to all peoples of the earth. How was that going to happen? David was promised that the kingdom would be eternal and that the king of that kingdom would be the Son of God. How would that possibly happen? Perhaps as we move on to stage 2, from David to the deportation to Babylon, maybe we'll get some answers there. Well, actually, no we don't, because at stage 2, everything seems to go horribly wrong. When King Solomon died, there was a big argument over who should be the next king. This resulted in the kingdom splitting into 2, a northern part and a southern part. The bigger northern part kept the name Israel. And for the next 200 years, that kingdom was ruled by a succession of 19 kings, all described in the Bible as turning away from God. Eventually, God sent the Assyrian Empire, which conquered Israel, took most of the people into captivity, and essentially that was the end of Israel. The much smaller southern part of the kingdom was called Judah. All the kings who ruled over Judah were descended from David, but they didn't really do much better than the kings of Israel. Judah lasted another 140 years after Israel, but they too turned from God. And God sent the Babylonian Empire, and they were conquered and taken into exile. It looked like a complete failure of God's plans and promises. How could a kingdom that no longer existed be eternal? How could that baby promised back at the beginning of Genesis be born into a nation that no longer existed? It seemed hopeless. While all this upheaval was going on, God sent prophets to explain to the people what was happening. Probably the most famous of these prophets was a man called Isaiah. And in his prophecy, there's a passage that is frequently read around Christmas time. Let's see how that passage begins. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. When Isaiah was writing, Israel had already gone into captivity. Judah was under threat and would soon be going into captivity. For them, it was a time of great darkness. But Isaiah speaks of a light dawning. It would actually be hundreds of years in their future, but Isaiah wrote in the present tense, emphasizing the certainty of it. But what was this great light to be? Let's read on and see. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So a baby son is going to be born. That baby will be called Mighty God, and he will reign on David's throne forever. Could this be the promise made to David? This was the question for the people of Israel and Judah who were so beleaguered at the time. Could they trust God to keep his promises when everything around them seemed to point in the direction of those promises failing? It was essentially the same thing facing that man and woman in the garden at the beginning of Genesis. Were they prepared to trust God? And it's essentially the same question facing us now. As we look at the world around us and there seems so much pain and suffering and turmoil, do we believe God is in control of this world? And what about that promise to Abraham? That what we're reading about here will result in a blessing for all peoples on earth, us. How can that possibly happen? Perhaps you want to join us next time for episode 4, where we begin to see some answers to these questions. Thank you for listening.